Hello everybody. I have put together a PowerPoint presentation and going to give you a sort of mock lecture to help prepare you for assignment 2. Now, I will just tell you that I have spent the last, feels like forever, it was probably only 30 minutes recording this presentation, only to find out I wasn't actually recording it. I went through the whole thing, but it was good because it enabled me to do a little bit of proofreading and make some adjustments. So here we are again. So this is assignment 2, where I'm asking you to write a positionality statement to situate yourself in your work. And so this is not content that is in our textbook, and so I am adding it because I feel like it is vitally important. So the title of this presentation, which I think will help you understand why I think it's so important, is Positionality and the Work of Decolonization in Education. So truth and reconciliation and situating ourselves in practice. So in this session, we'll explore who we are as educators, and this is, again, the assumption that many of you are making your way into early childhood education. If you are not, then when I use the term educator, this applies to whatever your career path is, wherever that takes you. These are things that you need to pay attention to as a citizen of Canada. So when I say citizen, I'm not necessarily talking about having citizenship as a Canadian, but actually a citizen. If you are living here, you're going to school here, you're visiting here, you're in Canada, you're on these lands, and so it's really important that you have an awareness of your positionality in Canada and how you are situated in your practice and in your life. So again, in this session, we'll explore who you are, who we are as educators, why it matters, and how this connects to Canada's commitment to truth and reconciliation. I thought I moved my little view. Anyway, we'll figure it out. Why positionality matters. So let's start by defining what positionality is. So it is the recognition that who we are, our identities, our histories or our inheritances, and social location, so where we physically are living and where our families have come from, shapes how we see, interpret, and act in the world. Education and educators or individuals are never neutral. That includes me. We are all shaped by history, culture, and place. Whether born in Canada or arriving from somewhere else, we are situated in ways that matter for our relationships with children, family, and community. To engage ethically in education and other places in Canada, we must reflect on who we are, where we come from, and what responsibilities this brings, especially in relation to truth and reconciliation and the process of decolonization. So, some examples of positionality in college learning. So we're all in college. I'm instructing, you're learning. So the event is a first-year course. The instructor assigns a group project where students must analyze Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, calls to action. Student A is born in Canada, has a settler background, grew up learning very little about Indigenous histories in school, which up until recently would be true for many of us that have gone to school in Canada. This student feels uncertain, even uncomfortable. They may think, I don't know much about this. What if I say the wrong thing? They might approach the project as simply an academic task to be completed. Student B, who is a first-generation immigrant whose family arrived in Canada within the last 10 years, for example, sees the project through the lens of being new to Canada. Wonders, how do I fit into reconciliation if my family wasn't a part of colonization or isn't a settler colonizer here? My focus on comparing with colonial histories student B might focus on comparing with colonial histories from their own country of origin. Because many other countries have a history of colonization, maybe not settler colonization, but definitely colonization. And so there's a difference. We're going to get to that. Student C is Indigenous. Their family members attended residential schools or were part of the 60s scoop. They feel a deep personal connection and emotional weight. They might think, this isn't just an assignment, this is my family story, this is my history, and it's still affecting us in deep ways and traumatic ways today. They may struggle with frustration if peers treat the calls to action casually or brush them off. So all students are engaging with the same assignment, but their positionality, settler, immigrant, Indigenous, shapes how they interpret the task, the emotions they bring to the work, the level of responsibility they feel. This demonstrates that in college, like in practice, positionality influences how we learn, engage, and respond. Just let that settle for a minute. So, settler colonizer versus immigrant in Canada. So settlers are people who come to stay on Indigenous lands and whose presence is sustained by ongoing systems of colonization. So systems and structures implemented, designed by the colonizing, the empire, in this case France and England, and that functions for settlers. It was designed for us, it functions for us. And it's sustained through those ongoing systems that are still here today. Settlers, even those who imagine themselves as guests or allies, benefit from Indigenous land dispossession and are embedded in colonial power structures that normalize their presence. So even if we believe that we understand the plight of Indigenous folks and position ourselves as allies, or recognize that we are guests, uninvited guests, I might add, on this land, we also have to recognize that even so, we still benefit from what happened to Indigenous people. We live on their land. We own land that they don't believe was ever ours or anybody's to own, but to live with in more balanced ways. So Tuck and Yang, 2012, wrote a very important, still, article called Decolonization Isn't a Metaphor. And so over the next few slides, I'm really leaning on and relying on the work that they did to help kind of unpack some of these ideas. And so they write, settlers are not immigrants. I think this is a really important point, and something that was a new idea for me until recently. That there's a difference. Settlers are not immigrants. Immigrants are beholden to settler colonial structures of domination, meaning that when immigrants come, they know already that they're going to be living within colonial structures. So this is how, sort of that saying, when in Rome, live like the Romans. So immigrants know when they come, this is the way. This is the way we live in Canada. Settlers come with the intention of making a new home on the land, of homemaking that insists on settler sovereignty over all things. So the difference is that when settlers came, they made new rules. They didn't feel that they were beholden to the people that were already here, which was the indigenous folks. They ignored them and said, no, we are going to hold dominion over this place, over this land, and we're going to use it. So they recreated the rules and the structures. Again, settler, colonizer versus immigrants to Canada. So immigrants are displaced or moved by choice or by force into settler colonial states. They do not own the colonial project, but they must navigate it in order to survive. Immigrants are not positioned ambiguously, sometimes used by colonial system as labor, sometimes they're scapegoated, but they're always situated on indigenous lands. So they too are benefiting from indigenous lands, but in too many cases, they're also exploited by colonial systems. So Tuck and Yang emphasize immigrants are not the same as settlers, yet their settlement is still made possible through indigenous dispossession. And so indigenous dispossession meaning dispossession of their lands, their language, their cultural ways of living on the land and living with, all of their knowledge and cultural systems, ceremonies. Those were all, it was all dispossessed. It was taken away from them. So our reality here in Canada, with education, colonization, and the ongoing work of decolonization, is to recognize that education is and has been a tool of colonization in Canada. Education in Canada has never been neutral or a purely benevolent project. It has been directly used to advance colonization through residential schools, where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in church and state-run schools designed to eliminate and kill the Indian in the child. Speaking Indigenous languages, practicing cultural traditions, and maintaining family ties were punished. Day schools and curriculum control. Even outside residential schools, Indigenous children in day schools were taught Euro-Canadian values, beliefs, histories, while Indigenous knowledge systems were erased or denigrated. Language suppression. Federal and provincial policies made English and French the only official language, marginalizing and outright banning Indigenous languages. And so, as a consequence, many Indigenous languages are lost or on the verge of being lost. And so we're seeing a lot of Indigenous language schools and projects over the last, even before Truth and Reconciliation, but I noticed that I think it's the Snakes Confederacy has a website where they're revitalizing their language, and it's really beautiful. They, if you get a chance, check it out. Textbooks and curriculum. Until very recently, Canadian textbooks glorified European explorers, and nation builders, and nation building, while erasing Indigenous histories, sovereignty, and contribution. So it's that idea that the conquerors, the colonizers, history is told from their perspective. Their stories are retold, and all other stories are pushed to the margins. So why the Truth and Reconciliation calls on education for transformational change? So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada explicitly identifies education as central to reconciliation, because education was also central to colonization. So in the BC Early Learning Framework, there's a quote by the Honorable Murray Sinclair, who's from Manitoba. I can't remember the nation that he's from. I should know this. But he is quoted as saying, education got us into this, education will get us out. Not sure how exactly, but I think this is part of my invitation for us to do this assignment, is to start thinking about what are the things that we can do, not just say, but do every day within our practice towards truth and reconciliation and decolonizing our relationship with Indigenous people and their knowledges and what they bring, who they are. So Calls to Action 62 urges governments and schools to make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties and Aboriginal people, historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, a mandatory educational requirement. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what that actually means, or how to move beyond decolonization as a metaphor towards decolonization that actually is in the doing, the acting, the commitments beyond just words. So Calls to Action 63 ask educators to build intercultural understanding, empathy, and respect. Its vision is that schools and educators can undo the harms of the past by restoring Indigenous knowledges and perspectives as living, contemporary, and valuable, helping all students, settler, immigrant, and Indigenous, to understand the true history of the land we are all living on, preparing future generations to live in ways that respect Indigenous sovereignty and relationship with the land. So decolonization is not a metaphor. Tuck and Yang warn that the word decolonization is often watered down to mean things like making classrooms more inclusive, adding Indigenous books to the reading list, or celebrating diversity. While these steps may be valuable, they're not decolonization. Decolonization, in its true sense, demands material change. The return of land, which is a big one for a lot of Indigenous people, and a lot of us white folks get our backs up about that. What does that mean? Because in our minds, it's just shifting one paradigm for another, right? So in our mind, it means that the Indigenous folks then become the colonizers. They colonize and they take away what we think is rightfully ours. Yet we took it from them to begin with. But anyway, it's complicated, and I'm not going to begin to even try to make meaning or sense of it here. It's kind of beyond this assignment, but it's just worth stating that decolonization demands material change. So we have to do something. We can't just say and repeat words. The recognition of Indigenous governance and a fundamental shift in how we live in relation to and with, I would say, with Indigenous people. They write, decolonization is not an and, it is an elsewhere. And I really love this quote, because I think that it really gets to that unknowability, that uncertainty, that creating something new and creating space to think about this differently. We can't keep repeating old structures and systems that marginalize and silence way too many people. We have to rethink education as a project that is world making. Okay, so here's some examples of how decolonization is often used, or used as a metaphor, and how that kind of stops or limits us from thinking differently. So a university creates an Indigenous Reading Week where students are encouraged to read works by Indigenous authors, which is actually a really valuable thing. I encourage all students, and even myself, to read Indigenous literature. But the institution does not change its hiring practices. So it's centering and creating the space for Indigenous Reading Week, but it's not. It's like hanging something up on the wall and saying, look what we're doing, look who we are, but it doesn't change its hiring practices, its land use, or decision-making structures. Maybe in this case, Indigenous faculty remain underrepresented and Indigenous governance is not recognized. And the campus sits on unceded Indigenous land without acknowledgement of land return. So it's the idea that it's not just enough to acknowledge the land that we're on is unceded, but doing would be to do something about it. So how can we work with Indigenous people? How can Indigenous people have a say in what happens in this learning institute? The content, the maybe land-based pedagogy, and have some governance and agency or autonomy on how the land is used and how education is connected to the land. So in this case, decolonization is used metaphorically as a synonym for equity or inclusion. So we're thinking about Indigenous authors and we're including them during this week. We're inviting students to read Indigenous authors. But the colonial structure remains intact. Okay, so what I want to invite you to do is to just pause this presentation and take about 5 minutes or so and write down 5 words or phrases you would use to describe yourself. Some examples might be, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm an immigrant, I'm an international student, I'm bilingual, but maybe actually you're more than bilingual. You can talk about the different languages, whether you live in a rural setting, or grew up in a rural setting, or if you grew up in the big city, if you consider yourself a settler, colonizer. Those are some examples. And then what I want you to reflect on and to write on is which identities feel most central. Which ones do you feel most connected to, or that represent the way that you see yourself? And which are invisible but still shape your life. So sort of thinking about Joe Harry's window here too. The things that you know about yourself that you don't think others know, but you think are really important to who you are as an individual. So just take some time just to do some reflective writing. And when you're done, come back to the presentation. So linking colonization, the TRC, and positionality. So again, positionality is saying that there's no neutral educator or education. The theory is that positionality teaches us that we are always situated. Our identities, histories, and privilege shape how we see the world. So there are glasses. The way that everything that we know, believe, understand is filtered through our identity, our inheritances, our history, where our families come from, and also what level of privilege we are situated in. So as a white settler, often it's a privilege that I just carry with me and don't often even think about. And that matters. That's actually really meaningful for us to recognize how we are situated within privilege. And I don't mean privilege as in necessarily we have lots of money and lots of things and can go and do anywhere, but it's just recognizing how the road is made straighter and flatter for us within a colonial system that was designed for us. So in Canada, this means asking, am I a settler? Am I Indigenous? Or am I an immigrant? How do these identities shape my relationship to this land, to its colonial history, and then to the process or practice of reconciliation? So a settler educator cannot claim I have no part in colonization, just as an immigrant cannot claim colonization doesn't involve me. Both are situated on Indigenous land and must recognize their relationship to it and how they benefit from it. Education as a colonial tool shows why positionality matters. So thinking about education as a colonial tool, first off, and then why positionality matters in regards to education as a colonial tool. So residential schools and curriculum erased Indigenous presence by pretending that Euro-Canadian ways of knowing were universal, true, and neutral. Positionality interrupts this myth of neutrality by insisting that all knowledge comes from somewhere and all knowledge is valuable. All knowledge is different. So educators who situate themselves can avoid, in theory, educators who situate themselves can avoid reproducing this erasure by acknowledging, for example, as a white settler, I have learned history in a way that centers Europe. I must actively seek Indigenous perspectives. So the truth and reconciliation calls to action require positionality. So we can't really engage with the truth and reconciliation unless we spend some time thinking about our positionality and how we're situated in Canada. Or in this colonial project, or educational project, or decolonization. So the TRC calls on educators to integrate Indigenous knowledge and histories. To do this ethically, educators must know their own position first. A settler educator integrating Indigenous stories must do so humbly, naming their limits and ensuring collaboration with Indigenous voices. Now, I would actually probably restate that by saying a settler educator integrating Indigenous stories, yes, must do it humbly, but also must do it firstly in collaboration with Indigenous knowledge keepers, elders, those whose stories these are to tell. They're not our stories, they're Indigenous stories. And yes, the TRC wants us to incorporate them, but there's protocols, and we need to find out what those are, and we can only do that by being in conversation with Indigenous folks. An immigrant educator might connect to their own story of migration with a responsibility to respect Indigenous sovereignty. So again, just different positionalities and how we might engage with that knowledge or how that might inform our practice. Without positionality, educators risk tokenism or appropriation. So tokenism being an example of that would be the university that has Indigenous Authors Reading Week, and that's it. Or some people can see September 30th, that day, it can be taken up as a form of tokenism. It's the only time, we wear an orange shirt or recognize the calls to action and the need for decolonization and the dispossession of Indigenous lands. Once a year isn't really enough. It needs to be ongoing. Appropriation is when we engage children or others in ceremony or Indigenous cultural context without permission, without protocols, without acknowledging who the story keepers are, who the knowledge keepers are, why we're doing what we're doing. It just becomes, or even language, incorporating Indigenous language into our practices without acknowledging the Indigenous voices is a form of appropriation. So with positionality as educators, we can begin thinking about and practicing accountability. So decolonization is not a metaphor, and this flows into the idea of positionality as accountability and our responsibility. So Tuck and Yang warn against treating decolonization as symbolic. Positionality helps us to resist this by demanding we ask, what is my role in ongoing colonial structures? How do I benefit? And what responsibilities follow? So again, that deep reflective practice. So another example, college opens every event with land acknowledgement, perhaps saying we acknowledge we are on the traditional territory of the Snakes Nation, but the curriculum continues to teach Canadian history from a Eurocentric, a Euro-settler perspective, rather. And so that might look at, and I'm thinking about a course that I'm teaching, professional practice, where a lot of the theories and practices and philosophers that underpin early childhood education all came from Europe, and we don't often incorporate any other knowledge systems into early childhood education today. So an example would be developmental psychology, or child development is a Euro-Western theory and philosophy that underpins early childhood education. Lost my train of thought there. And so it often, child development often is the primary lens in which we engage with children in childhood and create a practice around it without considering where it came from and whose stories are being told there and who's being privileged and who's being left out. It's a single story of who children in childhood could be, as an example. But it carries on. We rely on that one heavily, so I'm just going to leave it there. Okay. So positionality in action. So again, these are just me giving you some examples to help you find a way into this assignment. So you might write begin this assignment as a first-year student. I am a second-generation immigrant whose family came to Canada for opportunity. I now understand that we live on unceded Snakes land. You might say a little bit about what that is and what that means to you, why it matters, what it means to be an immigrant living on unceded Snakes land. What's your responsibility? What can you know about that, but also what might you do that might gesture towards allyship or living well with? My positionality means I benefit from systems built on Indigenous dispossession, even though my family didn't create them. As a future educator, I want to learn how to teach children about the truths and to make space for Indigenous knowledges and to question practices that normalize only settler perspectives. So the student names their location. They're immigrant on Indigenous land. I'm hoping you'll expand on this. This is just Cole's notes. They recognize benefits and responsibility, not feigning neutrality. Not my story. I'm new here. I don't know anything about this. I'm not implicated. You are. If you're living here, you're implicated because you're benefiting. So tell me how you're benefiting and what responsibilities you have for that. And then link the awareness to future practice. Again, teaching children responsibly. How is this going to inform the way that you think about your practice and enact your practice? So going back to the example of the land acknowledgement, without change, it's only symbolic. It stays at the level of words. So positionality is about self-location and accountability. It asks, who am I in relation to this land and history, and how will I act differently because of it? So just a little bit about positionality and social location and how those two come together or are entangled. So social location refers to the categories, identities, and contexts that shape where we stand in society. So social location is about the specifics, who we are. Race, class, gender, sexuality, age, language, religion, education, geographic location, citizenship, immigration status, indigeneity, and settler identity. Social location is about the structural conditions we are born into or move through. So it's very specific. And so that part of this assignment, in theory, should be fairly straightforward for you to detail. Positionality is going to be a little bit more challenging. It's going to ask you to reflect and to name. So positionality is what happens when we reflect on and name our social location in relation to others, to histories, and to systems of power. It's not just who you are, but how who you are shapes what you see, what you know, and what you, the words behind there. It's not just who you are, but how who you are shapes what you see, what you know, and how you act. So it's you're thinking about positionality. How are you thinking about it? As a white settler middle-class woman teaching in Canada, I recognize that I benefit from colonial and patriarchal systems which shape both my blind spots and my responsibilities. And so then I would go on to talk about what my blind spots are and what my responsibilities are, and how I think about that and what might need to change and how I might change it, and in the name of what. Okay, so the next part of this lecture today, and an assignment that I want you all to engage with when you get to this point, is we're going to do some mapping of our social locations with Padlet. And I don't know how I'm going to share this with you without stopping my recording again and then messing everything up. But in Padlet, I've created a Padlet that has columns in it, and the columns represent social location. I think there's 6 or 7 of them. You can, I will also, when I upload this to Moodle, I'll make sure that you have a link, or actually maybe I'll just embed the Padlet right into Moodle underneath this presentation, just for easy access. So I want you to go in there. I want you to respond to at least 4 of the categories, and you don't need to, you can put your name, you don't need to put your name. It's more just an exercise to get you thinking together, thinking individually, but also thinking collectively. So at the end of it, I'm hoping that we'll have quite a few different examples of how each one of you is situating or locating yourself. So that's only one part. The mapping is great, but then when we come to do an assignment, I want you to pick up that piece of positionality where you're reflecting on what those identities mean. So the identities that we've mapped out, I want you to reflect on what those mean in relation to power history and your responsibility. Here in Canada, so links to colonization and truth and reconciliation. So again, it's got a little repetitive, but just stressing that education was used to erase Indigenous identity and impose a single Canadian identity, and also a single Canadian narrative, a story of who is Canadian, what it means to be Canadian, who gets to claim that identity and that story, and who benefits from it. So the TRC calls on us to recognize diversity, truth, and accountability. Mapping our social location is one way to resist neutrality and begin the work of reconciliation. So reflection prompts. These are things that I want you to journal and reflect on, and this will also help you, will contribute to your assignment and should show up in your assignment. So which parts of your social location were easiest to name? Think about that. Name them. Which ones were harder or ones you hadn't thought of before? And maybe think a little bit about why. So in the first case, which parts of your social location were easiest to name, and think about why that is. What's implicated? And then the harder ones, or ones you hadn't thought about. What comes up for you when you're reflecting on those? How might your social location influence how you interpret what happens in a college class? So example, a truth and reconciliation assignment, group work, or curriculum. So yeah, and that one you're going to have to spend a little bit of time with, and of course it's going to be a different story, a different narrative for each one of you because of what you bring to your practice, where you come from, meaning your family history, your language, your culture, your values, your beliefs. How does this mapping activity support you to connect to your responsibility or response ability? So the ways that you're able to respond as an individual in Canada today. So when you open up the Padlet, just to give you a bit of a heads up, you'll see it when you go there, but some of the categories are, no, that's wrong, never mind. I'm just reading my notes, but they don't connect to that. You'll see what the categories are when you open up Padlet. And so I'm going to end with just a quick overview of our assignment, and you will see it's embedded in Moodle in a couple places. I think right on your landing page where it says assignments, assignment 2 will be there, and you can open that up and it gives you a fuller description plus the grading guide, marking guide. Oh my Lord. But it's also underneath the assignment Dropbox as well. There's another link to this description. So this is right out of the description. I just wanted to put an overview, the purpose, and just instructions just to bring that up here again to get you thinking about it. So this assignment invites you to explore positionality, the way your cultural background, language, personal experience, and identity shape how you communicate. So thinking about this lecture in particular, your positionality and situatedness and how that connects to decolonization and truth and reconciliation is step 1. And I'm asking you then to think about how this informs your identity as a communicator, right? Because that's the word. It's interpersonal communications. It's about learning about who we are within the relationships and how communication connects us to people, and our identity, and how we live well together. And so extending beyond that, we're looking at who we are as communicators. I don't know if that makes sense or if I'm just confusing you. So the example here is in early childhood education, communication is not just about words, but also about building trust, respect, and belonging. So that's all part of interpersonal communication. That's how we do it. We use language. By reflecting on your own communication style and situating yourself, you're preparing to enter your practicum or a future career with greater self-awareness, intercultural understanding, and a professional presence and awareness. So the instructions are 8 to 1,000 word reflection that integrates text, visual, and or multimedia. You may choose a traditional essay format or create a multimodal project such as combining written reflection with image, digital storyboards, voice recordings, or a Padlet collage. Creativity is welcome as long as your ideas are clearly expressed and connect to these concepts. So I'm going to say, if you're doing a written reflection, 800 words is going to be a lot, and will be, I think, enough for you to be able to engage with these ideas and articulate and make meaning. If you're going to do a multimodal project, of course, your words, your images, your storyboard, your voice recording is going to represent part of that 800 words. So it's going to be a little bit more open. And if you have any questions or concerns about that, just to make sure you're on the right track, as always, I always encourage students to reach out to me and for support. And in some cases, I've had students show me the beginnings of their assignments to get feedback. So prior to your due date, if you want to show me what you're working on to make sure you're on the right track, I'm not going to mark it, but I will read through it and I'll offer you some feedback and some direction. So just know, anytime, any assignment, anywhere, if you want to submit it ahead of time for feedback, or connect with me just to flesh out some ideas, always super willing to do that. I think that's it, and I actually managed to record it this time, so that's awesome. I am going to say goodbye, and then I will post this for all of you. Okay, take care.